When Thomas Tuchel was unveiled as the England manager in January 2025, he was open and bold about his task, saying, "I'm here to put a second star on the shirt." Tuchel set his sights not just on winning silverware, but winning the World Cup in North America this summer. England often expect, but rarely as insistently as this. And why not? The squad is full of quality, admired all over the world in a way that hasn't always been true. There's an extra resonance this summer too, since it is 60 years since 1966. That figure means that England are on the longest major trophy drought of any previous World Cup winner. But as the years of hurt have ticked by, how close really were England to winning one more? Should they already have another star or two above the crest? And which tournaments did they let slip away? Can Tuchel really go and win in North America this summer? I'm Chief Sports Writer Lawrence Ostlere, and I'm joined by Chief Football Writer Miguel Delaney.
Hello.
And Senior Sports Writer Kieran Jackson.
Hello.
And we'll be debating this on the second episode of our new podcast, Copper Independent. This is our podcast covering every side of the World Cup, from the football to the politics to the history, bit of nostalgia too. And Miguel, you can be the arbiter, given Kieran and I are England men and England fans.
Fair. Yeah.
So maybe, Miguel, on that note, we can start with you. How are England seen now? If we start with where we're at, 2.5 months from the 2026 World Cup, how are England recognised in a way that perhaps has changed from the past, from previous World Cups?
I would say the growth of the Premier League, and maybe more relevantly to this conversation, the last four tournaments have genuinely changed perception. England are pretty much now seen as a team that go far in tournaments, where previously they've been seen as kind of, well, a little bit like Spain had been 20, 30 years ago, in kind of like quarterfinals, no more, underperformers, bottlers, if you like, or to use Platini's phrase that has been used a little bit about the Champions League this season, lions in the winter, lambs in the summer, in this case. But I think that has changed for this tournament. They're genuinely seen as, I'd say, among the top 4 or 5 teams, definitely among the group that would be considered favourites that should think about winning it. I think that's been the case in 2022. Obviously, we can get into Euros as well. I mean, Euro 2020. But yeah, I mean, if there's one thing you would say for Gareth Southgate's entire time in charge of England, which I know is open to debate itself, that we will get into in this podcast, it is that it did change the perception. And yeah, England go in with one of the best squads in the world. Not a perfect squad, but no one does have a perfect squad. And a team that everyone thinks should be considering winning this competition, which is obviously something that actually has been subject of debate in the past, especially among other nations. And I know that well, being half Irish, half Spanish.
I was at Tottenham training ground today, where England are preparing for their friendly this week against Japan, and Thomas Tuchel was talking to the media a little bit, and he made the point that you made, Miguel, that England are among those favourites. They're among that contingent of teams who can be, I think his phrase was, can be competitive. But he also did seem to play down England's chances a little bit, which I thought was interesting. There's just a tinge, it always happens around this time, just a little tinge of negativity coming around. Obviously, the Uruguay game a few days ago was pretty uninspiring, albeit a third-string England team. And I just got the sense that he is perhaps just managing expectations at the moment. There was also a reference to some quite average stats among England's attacking players. He talked about how Harry's the only one who is, racking up goals and assists at club level, which I thought was an interesting comment to make, quite a blunt comment to make as well. He named them as well, Eze, Saka, all these players who perhaps slightly underperforming. So I think there's a sense, certainly from the England camp, that they are just keeping a lid on what can be achieved in North America, and probably rightly so. I think, as you mentioned, Spain, Brazil, these sides are perhaps a cut above right now.
I mean, and maybe actually attacking quality ends up being the difference in that sense, which is, I suppose, I think a debate we'll be getting into at the end. But just before we bring in Kieran, I suppose one point on Tuchel there is although he's been open in the past, or certainly on taking the job at winning the World Cup, I suppose the closer we get, and the more all this ramps up, the more individual pressure is on him, in the way that maybe isn't the case. Because obviously one of the big things with England in the past has been, especially something that reached a height around the kind of golden generation, the Sven years, was this massive heave of pressure on the team. Obviously a lot on the manager, but it was just sort of collective thing. Whereas one of the ways the discussion around England has massively changed, of course, is because the Premier League is now so massive that the club discussion is all the time. I mean, one of the things that Southgate did, I suppose, is actually try to kind of restore the importance of the England team. And I think that has happened. But it only happens at certain points now. It's not like the long build-ups of 20 years ago or 30 years ago. And so in that sort of context, it means that kind of if expectation grows, it feels like it's going to be personally on Tuchel to complete the job. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a bit of expectation management. Obviously some of it on the team, but mostly maybe for himself. Especially now he's signed a new contract as well. So he's saying until the year 2028.
Yeah, I feel like the expectation management is needed, right? Because I was going through some stats and I feel like the FIFA World Rankings have their flaws, but in this case, it's quite a good indicator of where England have been going into previous tournaments. So they started in 1992. 1994, they didn't qualify. 98, were 5th going into that tournament. 2002, we were 12th. 2006, we were 10th, and that was seen as like the golden generation start, and we were only 10th in the world rankings. By 2010, we were 8th, 2014, 11th, and 2018, when we reached the semi-finals, we were 12th. But since 2019, we've been in the top 5 and haven't dropped out. So like in terms of understanding whether expectations are more than 20 years ago, they probably should be, because we are seen in that elite group of international teams. We've reached 2 finals in the Euros. And I think just compared to 20 years ago, despite the golden generation and despite the players that were there, we still had embarrassing moments. We didn't qualify for a Euros in the midst of that. Ahead of 2006, we were ranked 10th. And I think we lost to Northern Ireland in qualifying. So I feel like we've eliminated those bad results as a country, or our national football team has. And I think that's where the expectation kind of lies.
You think that this England squad now is in the right place to win a World Cup, in the sense of you've got someone like Harry Kane, John Stones, perhaps you could put in a similar category, where they're perhaps in the autumn of their career, and then you've got a lot of very talented young players, and maybe not a great collection of players in that 26 to 30 bracket. I think Declan Rice might be in that age bracket, but maybe not many. I just wonder if it's sort of an odd time where is the back end of the Southgate era and the start of the Tuchel era, and perhaps not that many players in the sweet spot ready to go and deliver on a major tournament.
Kane is so massive, to be fair. Beyond that, I just think with Southgate as well, it's not like he brought his team to a natural peak, because Euro 2024 was quite a strange tournament, and how suddenly he jettisoned loads of kind of stalwarts, and he almost went back on everything he'd done over the previous 3 campaigns or 3 tournaments, Southgate. And almost suddenly, having had a no-star system, was trying to cram in as many new stars as possible. Form is a different issue, obviously. Fatigue is a debate that we'll cover in future podcasts, especially as regards how you actually win a World Cup. But I think England just have this... They've got so many players of a certain level that already makes a difference. And it's where Kane, I think, is so huge, because even if you go through the other potential, the main potential winners, the only one that really has a goal scorer of a similar level, like an actual number 9 of a similar level, is France. Spain don't. They're relying on Oyarzabal. Brazil, obviously, I mean, they're calling up Pico Thiago from Brentford, not to diminish him, but for Brazil to be calling up a Brentford striker is... I suppose you call it a historical anomaly.
Just quickly around the dynamic around, or the narrative around Kane this summer, I think is going to be so interesting, because remember 2 years ago, people were calling him to be out of the team because he looked like his race was run for that season. Again, he's had another grueling season with Bayern Munich this year. So this summer in hot conditions in the US, I think we'll cover this in future podcasts, but you can't emphasize enough how the humidity and the conditions will play a part. And we saw with the semi-final, when we brought on Ollie Watkins, way more threatening. He scored the winner. And even in the final, Kane was taken off. So, it's fascinating that, on another topic, that Watkins isn't in the current squad. So it is so interesting around the number 9 position at the moment.
I think on that as well, there's a fascinating thing with Kane where, especially now that Southgate's gone, as regards players, he almost is the lightning rod for all the energy, and I would mostly say it's negative energy around this long wait, especially because, look, before he went to Bayern, let's make no bones about it, Kane was kind of cast as a loser, basically, someone like destined to always be second place. I think it's actually why his first title with Bayern was so important, something that was prolonged, of course, because in his first season they lost to Leverkusen, And because he's obviously the senior player in the team, they're the longest now out of everyone almost, because he's there since he's 2016. He's been the consistent performer through Southgate, and he's the one that almost wears all of this from. I mean, we obviously mentioned the how England are the World Cup winner now on the longest drought, because Uruguay have obviously won Copa America since, and every winner since then has won a more recent trophy. But there's almost a bit more to it than that. So of any country to win an international trophy at any point, there are only 4 on longer droughts than England. That's Ethiopia, Bolivia, Israel, and USSR. So that's a country that doesn't exist, and one, Israel, who now don't even play in the competition that they won. And I suppose the key question as regards this podcast and for players like Kane is, how much does that pressure actually matter at this moment? And this isn't me dismissing it, because I think it obviously does matter, but what is the weight? Do we think it affects a team going in at this point?
I feel like that entire statistic was just designed to mock England, but that's fair enough.
Well, the stats are there. Look, I'm not saying it. I'm merely referring to the statistics and how they've built this pressure. But I suppose a key to this question over whether it actually affects the current players, it is pretty worth discussing what that pressure actually is and how it's built, which of course forms a key question of what World Cups should England have actually won, and what wasted opportunities maybe weren't actually as good an opportunity as was thought at the time. Basically, should England have actually won a World Cup since '66?
So let's get into that question. Should England have won another World Cup? England have played in 16 World Cups, men's World Cup tournaments, reached 3 semi-finals, obviously one in 1966, and exited at the semi-final stage in 1990 and in 2018, Gareth Southgate's Brave Boys going out to Croatia. So when we look at that record, I mean, maybe I'll throw to you first, Kieran. Do you feel like more should have been achieved in that time period since 1950 and the first World Cup in which England entered?
Yeah, I mean, of course is the answer. Like the record is absolutely not befitting the prestige of the country. We have the biggest league in the world, which I think Miguel can talk better than me on this, but that kind of plays into what the national team stands for, how the national team works. And I think it is interesting about, obviously with a major tournament, there is only one winner. It comes around every 2 years, 4 years for a World Cup. And there are other teams and other countries who have golden generations themselves. So we can't always be seen to be the highest team. I mentioned the world rankings earlier, and that kind of illustrates why or where England were in certain periods. We can't always expect to be at the top. One thing I would like to bring in here about the World Cup tournament specifically is the role of luck, particularly with the draws, right? Like 2018, we came second in our group and we had a fantastic draw to the semi-final, and Croatia in the semi-final. It was a huge opportunity. Obviously, France in the final would have been a tall order. But that to me feels like a tournament where, you know, you make your own luck to an extent, but that was a very fortuitous route to such a latter stage of a tournament. Similarly, when in 2002, the other way, we were lowest ranked going into that tournament, did okay in the groups, beat Argentina, beat Denmark convincingly in the round of 16, and then drew Brazil. And I think, you know, it was kind of widely seen at that stage of the tournament, 2002 quarterfinals, that whoever won that match would be firm favourites for the rest of the tournament. But yeah, in that 2002 tournament, I think the other quarterfinals were Germany against USA, Spain played South Korea, and Senegal played Turkey. And if England had beaten Brazil, they'd have played Turkey. So, like, again, sometimes the luck falls your way, but I mean, overall, there are fundamental reasons why England haven't gone further. And it's not just luck, but I just thought I'd bring that into it.
To interject there as well, actually, I suppose bring my Irishness into it. As regards 2002, and obviously the film came out earlier this year about Saipan and Roy Keane, there is a pretty strong belief in Ireland that because of the way that tournament panned out, with so many surprises, relatively weak teams left, that had Roy Keane played, Ireland could at least have got to a semi-final. Because, you know, they'd beaten the Dutch in qualifiers. Keane was that important. And look, I think Ireland were a decent team, or a good side to be fair then. But it does speak to, I think, what you're talking about there is how open that competition is considered. And if Ireland are talking about a potential semi-final or final, have been knocked out by Spain and penalties, I would actually say, other than 1990, I think that was the one England should really have been looking to as the one they could have won. It was the golden generation at the start of that era when a lot of these players were beginning to go to the distance in the Champions League, maybe just before the Chelsea boys like Terry and Lampard came in. But also the Sven era felt at its freshest.
Yeah, for sure. I think it's interesting as well. Like, are we going to mention the penalty word? Like, 3 really big exits on penalties, and the one we won in 2018, we still needed a penalty shootout to win. If our penalties record is better, and Southgate worked so hard on trying to work at penalties, the psychology behind penalties. If our penalty shootout record was better, like, we'd have got way further in tournaments. And then sometimes you need to ground out that win, and we just haven't done that in the past.
But this is also where there's a bit of a weird thing, and I suppose this kind of cuts to the centre of the whole debate, I would say, in that, so England have had, it's funny, like watching from Ireland for a lot of these, there was a spell, especially from around 96 to 2006, where England are often involved in the most epic games of tournaments. And I suppose in the World Cup in particular, we are talking 98, which is a brilliant World Cup game against Argentina. 2002 was a tense occasion of drama, if not a great game, the defeat to Brazil. Maybe similar a little bit with Portugal 2006. It was a 0-0 draw that, yes, went to penalties. But I suppose it's one of those things where, as regards England's actual, whether they underperformed, because I do think, look, on the pure maths of it, England are the great underperformers, especially since Spain won in 2010 and have won Euros since. England are, whatever about the long wait and droughts and all this, they're the biggest country with the strongest football history, the strongest league to go out winning. I mean, if you're thinking who should have won a World Cup recently, the next closest is probably the Netherlands. And that's a much smaller country than England. But like within that, obviously we're talking about a lot of epic games, but there's a difference between a noisy exit that feels like a wasted opportunity on the night and whether that was a wasted opportunity for the entire campaign. So, I mean, exactly what you're talking about there, Kieran, I suppose, because England in the last 16 in 98, I think that was one of their best performing competitions in terms of the level they played at. So it's actually, I think it's a better campaign, say, than 2006, where they got around further to the quarterfinal. It felt better. But would that have meant they actually won it? I mean, that was, I think there's parallels there with 1982, where England did peter out, where England had a strong team, could rue their nature of exit, but the field was so good. Would they really have enough to go the distance? That's where, when I was going through England's kind of record, and a lot of campaigns actually feel like this. I don't think there's that many where England should be frustrated that they were thinking like, we're obviously one of the best teams in this. We should have won it.
I completely agree. When I look back at 98, 2002, 2006, England had good teams, good chances, very good players. Came up just short in big matches, but I don't feel that there was a tournament there where England should have won or really left something out there. I felt 2002 was about the right moment to exit against a better Brazilian team. I felt had we beaten, and probably should have beaten, Portugal in 2006, we would have come up against a better team anyway. And so then the tournament for me that stands out is not 2018, when England did get to the semi-finals, but were very poor after that Kieran Trippier free kick against Croatia, and the second half was terrible. I don't have the stats to hand, but Croatia completely dominated, and England were running. It was one of those games where Harry Kane was running through treacle, and it was a matter of time before Croatia scored. I don't think England should have won that tournament, and France were a much better team as well. 2022 for me, 2022 is actually the one. I think I was at that quarterfinal. I think you were there as well, Miguel, against France, and it was shocking to see Harry Kane miss a penalty, and it felt like a game that England, not that England were better than France, but a game that England could have won. And I say could rather than should, but had they won, would have opened up a tournament that was definitely winnable. Like Argentina were a good team with an incredible player, but they weren't. I don't think that Argentina team, any of us would say, were a great, great World Cup winning team. France obviously were fantastic, but England came very close to beating them. For me, that was the one. It was Southgate, the peak Southgate era, and it was, to me, the one that feels like it got away.
You mentioned Argentina there. Isn't this a bit of a key thing in this as well, where regardless of Argentina's actual quality, and I think this actually refers to Kieran's point about luck as well, and 2018, which I'll get to in a moment, I suppose. Look, the actual results end up dictating the memory of this, and hindsight's a great thing and all that. But I suppose there's two dimensions to a World Cup in that sense. There's the team that generates that emotional momentum where you feel they're on this journey. Argentina was obviously the case in 2022, especially after winning, after losing the opening game to Saudi Arabia. And it's like the journey itself amplifies everything. You can feel the mood around the team growing. And then there's a similar sort of team, the team of the tournament, who don't win it, but equally it is seen as a kind of the great lost opportunity. There's obvious examples there. The Netherlands in 74, maybe the Dutch in 98. You mentioned 2006 there. Italy in that tournament had maybe the closest dynamic to Argentina in that from very early on you could see all this heave around them. It was on the back of Calciopoli. Obviously all these kind of historical resonances like, how Italy often do the best out when it's on the back of controversy. Whereas I've never really felt that with England. Even 2018, it came out of nowhere a little bit. And I do think I would disagree with Kieran there, because I think 2018, it was a necessary tournament for England in the sense that it set them right again. And it's amazing now. If you actually look at the squad quality, I don't think it's since from 2020 to now, it's been so much better than it was in 2018. But they needed that competition to kind of restore respectability, to restore confidence. But I did think that, as you mentioned, Lawrence, once you got into that game against Croatia, the midfield began to have an effect. England just didn't have that type of player. They didn't have that extra quality. Kane missed that chance, which felt so significant. And it felt they'd gone as far as they could, but they'd set a marker.
Yeah, I get you, Miguel, to be fair. And just to go back on the concept of emotion in a tournament, it is so interesting because I feel like Argentina just rode the wave of their emotion throughout 2022, right? And then we try and do the same. I think 2018, there was a lot of emotion. There's a lot of emotion at every World Cup, obviously. But the way it builds and builds and builds. Won that penalty shootout against Colombia, a big thing to do. And it's just funny the way that the emotion gets so high that England often, let it get the better of them. So Kane missed a penalty at crunch time. In 2006, Wayne Rooney got sent off, over emotional. David Beckham got sent off in 98, over emotional. But they were massive moments. Beckham was in extra time. But you see the way that, and Paul Gascoigne's yellow card in 1990, there's so many different elements of emotion where England let it get the better of them, as opposed to actually perform better. And I think that's a key thing in a tournament. The games come really quickly, and I think that's a big factor as well.
I do think that's such a big thing in the sense that, so for all England's history, for all the size of the country, the football culture, if you start to individually go through those World Cups, and look, Messi's the prime example from 2022 as the greatest player of all time, but it does feel like England had good squads, but it's like they very rarely had players of the quality to really match the elite international sides. In the sense that, so it's not like a Euros, where a Euros, because it's been shorter, it has been won by Greece's and Denmark's. That doesn't happen at World Cup. So if you go to 98, we talk about Brazil with Ronaldo. Same with 2002, Ronaldo, Rivaldo, Ronaldinho. 86, Maradona. 82, a Brazilian team that actually got to the same stage as England. Well, it has Socrates, Zico, and does just feel that England have been, and this is where this era is so key, for all the great players they've had, it's been maybe lacking that extra quality, which is why there have actually been very few tournaments that I would say they should see. So they should see it as ones that England have had a won. For all of 60 years of hurt, I would say it's mostly kind of, 46 years of mild frustration than a few others.
Doesn't make such a good song, but yeah.
No.
Okay, so to wrap it up then, maybe we should get your verdicts on whether England should have won a World Cup. I'll start with Kieran. What do you think? Do you feel like 2 World Cups would be fair for England's repertoire? You could look at Holland and say, do England deserve to have 2 more World Cups than the Dutch, for example? How do you see it?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I feel like 2 is fair. I know you lambasted me for suggesting 2018, but we did end up in a semi-final, and it was against Croatia. It wasn't against one of the big boys. So you've got to understand how big an opportunity it was, even if the quality of the team wasn't so good. I think it's hard to get through the 2 semi-finals. We weren't outplayed in either. I think 1990 felt like, well, wasn't alive, but it felt like a moment in the history of English football where it just didn't fall for us on the night in penalty shootout against Germany. And that happens. I mean, the Germans would argue on contrast, in the 1966 final, we had a goal which probably wasn't over the line. So I think we should be appreciative that we have one, but for sure should have had another.
What's the key with 1966 as well? I mean, Germany had a burgeoning Franz Beckenbauer. England had a Ballon d'Or winner in Bobby Charlton, which I do think is indicative. So I would go, I think 1990 was huge, just from the perspective that in that semi-final, England had obviously proved themselves the equal of the eventual champions, West Germany. So, and I don't think we can say that about pretty much any World Cup since 66 then, because like even 70 when England were defending champions, they were beaten by a better Brazilian team in the group stage. But with that West German game, and especially with Gaza playing so well, with Lineker on such good scoring form, had they managed to get through against Germany, had Waddle's shot gone in, they wouldn't hit the bar, they could well have beaten Argentina, a really turgid Argentina team, and who had Maradona's injury issues as well. Outside that, 2002 as well, but look at the difference in that game. It's Rivaldo and Ronaldinho, as good as Michael Owen was at that point. And then is that? I suppose, as Lawrence said as well, I'd go 2022, but that's what I remember writing about the kind of when we were trying to analyse 2022, the morning after they'd gone out. And it was one of those ones like for all the England World Cups usually end in inquests, because I think they often feel like premature exits rather than necessarily wasted opportunities. That was when we were just kind of left thinking, well, look, it was a 50-50 team against, or 50-50 game against a great side. Could have gone either way. It did. There's no real shame in it. It was just one of those things that happened. Yeah, okay, frustrating. Could have gone further, but it's just a knockout game.
Just finally on England, do we think what are we 2.5 months out from the World Cup? How do we rate England's chances of actually winning the tournament, of winning a second World Cup?
I think that they're there or thereabouts. I know, which I suppose is a bit of an unsatisfactory answer, but it's as good as you can be at this point. And I suppose this is why Tuchel has been hired, actually, because to try and take it from where they are to that next level. That's where the manager is so important. And it's why I do think there are so many parallels with West Germany in the 80s. And you don't necessarily have to be at the top of a cycle with a great side to win it, because this is where other elements that Kieran has mentioned can come in, like luck, seizing momentum, seizing the opportunity, can have an effect. But then I suppose that's also where actually dealing with the potential historic neurosis is so important.
I do feel like, I know we hype it up before every World Cup, but it does feel like a big moment. We've got one of the genuine world-class managers available and is managing England. Like it's a huge moment. I know it's his first taste of international football, but to have that key person, and for as much as I rate Gareth Southgate, and I really did, he did fantastic things, I think people would say he's not a world-class manager, whereas Thomas Tuchel has proven it. So that feels like a big moment. But it's all about the way the World Cup pans out. I mean, it's a 48-team World Cup. There's another phase in the last 32. Like, who knows what kind of impact that has? You could get a Norway in the last 32, and that'd be a difficult tie. So I think there's more elements of luck with this tournament, but in terms of the quality of the squad and the quality of the manager, it does feel like a real opportunity.
I think it will probably come down to fatigue. I feel it was something that was discussed today. The England press conference was fatigue, and I wonder if that will ultimately be the issue. And we always go back to, Miguel, you talked about Harry Kane and how important he is. Ultimately, I haven't really seen him come to life and dominate a major tournament. And I worry that he will be leggy and exhausted by the time this World Cup comes around in heat. As you say, Kieran, 48 teams, a massive 106 game tournament, I think it is. So that to me is the biggest issue. Declan Rice is currently carrying an injury and he's probably not going to rest between now and Arsenal trying to win lots of trophies. So I am concerned about that, and I think ultimately that will probably be Tuchel's undoing, and it's something that he has no control over, really.
Well, I suppose that's where Kane being at Bayern may be so important. 18 teams in the league, Bayern have dominated. Who knows, maybe that could end up being the difference.
There it is, Miguel Delaney officially predicting England will win the World Cup. One last point to discuss before we wrap up, and we've also got to continue picking our World Cup 11, is perhaps how England are dealing with and will deal with you called it the neurosis, I think, Miguel, that has built up over a number of years, the pressure of trying to end however many, 60 now years of hurt. I mean, how big a factor is that? It's obviously something that Southgate, I think, did a very good job of lifting the weight on the players' shoulders, making the camp and the environment a little bit more relaxed. And I think that did bring rewards and did help England get deeper and further in tournaments. Tuchel today was talking about that as well, about how England's his early pre-camp in Florida, where they got warm-up matches. He wants family to be around. He wants only one training session in the morning and then a relaxed afternoons. He really wants a kind of open, chilled out feel before the pressure and the intensity of the tournament itself, and obviously a very long tournament. So is that something that England are equipped to deal with? And is it something that ultimately can derail an England team when they get to the semi-finals, if they were to get that far?
Southgate used to call it the weight of the shirt. Not like, look, he was talking, with that he wasn't necessarily talking about actually winning the World Cup. He was talking about basically joining up with England at all and going to tournaments, and like the kind of the heave of pressure that maybe did inhibited some of the tournaments we're talking about in the past. But I suppose the question then is whether that extends itself, because like exactly what this podcast is about, I suppose, it's there's one thing suddenly where the quarterfinals aren't the issue they used to be, where then it becomes about the semi-finals and the final. And maybe kind of a bit of a parallel I've been thinking about is actually Atletico Madrid, who are out maybe much more so than Tottenham Hotspur, I'd say, are considered maybe the most neurotic club team in football. Like they've got so many hang-ups, it's actually part of their identity. And it was almost like, even when they won a league in 2014, even when they were getting they got to the final of the Champions League, that was almost more just, it was set up to fail and suffer even more exquisitely, because then they get to the final and what happens? There's a 94th minute equaliser from Sergio Ramos, from the player they maybe hate most, from the team they hate most, for Real Madrid. And I think that's where England have to kind of force their way through this. And I suppose you're getting into a bigger question where, does this weight matter to the current players? And I suppose weight being pun very much intended there, because it's a weight and it's actually a weight in terms of how heavy it all is. I mean, I'm curious to what you guys think there.
Not to generalise, but I feel like the pressure question is the biggest obstacle, because when do you see pressure come out in its forest? When you it's fight or flight? And countless times the last few tournaments, in the penalty shootout defeat to Italy in the Euros final, that was pressure. It's Harry Kane missing a second penalty, that was a pressure moment. And there's no way you can't say that the weight of the shirt and the weight of history didn't matter in those moments. That's what pressure builds, 100%. So I think that is definitely a factor, and possibly the biggest factor stopping an England victory in a World Cup. And the longer, obvious to say, the longer it goes on, the more the pressure builds.
I do agree with that to an extent. I do wonder whether this current crop, the weight of history is less relevant and less influential. I had the chance to speak to Elliot Anderson today, and he was talking about his first World Cup memory being Kieran Trippier's free kick against Croatia, or one of his first memories, which made me feel incredibly old, but also just made me think it's a generation that actually, if they don't really remember the kind of the Sven era, the Capello era, the Beckham era, the press and the voraciousness and the aggressiveness around the discourse of the England team at that time, then they really, generally their view of England is set by Gareth Southgate, and his era has been much more pleasant, whether it be relations with the media, whether it be just the general kind of PR view of this team. And so I get the impression, particularly for the younger players, that maybe they aren't so weighed down in a way that a lot of the teams in our lifetime and in our era would have been.
I suppose on that as well, there's a bit of maybe an irony there, where I would say the opportunity for this tournament is certainly as good as any tournament since 1970 in terms of where England are and how justified the hype is. And again, you can have a whole other podcast on the nature of hype around England. But the opportunity is greater than ever. But the actual expectation isn't. And I don't mean that's not people thinking that England shouldn't win. It's something you touched on there, Lawrence. It's like, even going back to 2002, the actual build up to the World Cup used to be 6 months long. And this fed it, going back to kind of the real kind of like, look, this is almost a media discussion as much as a football discussion. Going back to the kind of the peak of like tabloid UK around the late 80s, early 90s, or even further, like the build up to the World Cup would be characterized by headline, like back pages, like in the name of Allah, go, all like, you know, managers getting cast up as kind of vegetables. And like there was basically just this constant heave around the team, even when the team itself wasn't as good as it is now. Whereas now, because, well, A, the culture is different, and B, just the noise around the Premier League is so constant that the players themselves are used to. Suddenly there's just like, you get to an England camp like this and it's just not the same. There isn't the same build-up around it. There isn't the same heave. And in any case, they're used to the constant noise of the Premier League. Like, I think that's maybe an interesting one in itself. So there's a lot of England players in the Arsenal side. I would wager they'd feel the nervous tension around every single title game for Arsenal is bigger than an England game at the moment.
I'd say at the moment you're right. I think the hype before this tournament might be less than previous tournaments with those factors at play, Miguel. I think you're right, but I think when you get to the knockout phase, I think it's inescapable. The idea that they're going to be in a casual, calm setting in Kansas City, just chilling out before a World Cup quarterfinal against Brazil in Miami on a Saturday night, I just don't see it. They'll be on their phones. The whole world will be fueled by the World Cup. And it's all about whether you can deal with the pressure. They'll be on social media. It will be everywhere. So I think when the going gets tough, I think is when they'll see it the most.
Yeah, that is a good point. That the pressure, as you said, Miguel, there's almost this peak, wasn't there, in the late 90s of tabloid influence, and the back pages really mattered, and they could destroy David Beckham, they could destroy Gareth Southgate overnight.
And having worked through the Southgate era, this is something that really stood out. Like, given exactly as you say, given the relationship between the manager and the pack that covered him used to often be vicious, very antagonistic. There's a lot of anecdotes I could tell here. So just as an example of one, there was one story about Bobby Robson. He turned up at some event outside an international break, and some of the pack were there at the time. Not all the pack, just some of the pack. And he wondered, well, what are you lads doing here? We've come to turn you over, mate. Which is like, I mean, that is, and I think other words than those were used. That is astonishing to the kind of the current media climate. And it did lead to this weird situation with Southgate where, exactly as you say about social media, Lawrence, where the pack or the press were considered soft on Southgate because he was nice to them, whereas maybe half the English support hated him. And it was weird at Southgate because obviously there was two different dynamics to it. One was an English support that were obviously kind of really disliked what they considered the whole woke thing, or Southgate being almost this kind of spokesman for the country in the way Tuchel couldn't really be bothered with because he's not English, to be fair, he's here for the football. And the other side of it was actually maybe some of the quote-unquote woke audience who just didn't think Southgate was a good manager. And in the middle of that were the press, who were just considered very soft on him. But yeah, it is a very changed dynamic.
You know, a quote is good when Miguel starts laughing before he says it, right?
It is delivered in more choice terms than that, but I've obviously softened it, given this will be on YouTube, and you get penalised for swear words.
Was that the end of Bobby Robson pretty soon after that?
So I think it was between 88 and 90. I'm not entirely sure. Yeah, and remember as well, at 90 it was going to be his last tournament, and then suddenly after they'd gone out in the group stage in 88, they had this kind of surprise revelation. Obviously, a World Cup in 1990 that is considered to have revitalised football in so many senses, not least with the England team.
Okay, we'll wrap up with our usual stoppage time filler, where we always have a question to debate, and the quick question to debate this week is deciding England's best World Cup match. And I think we're talking more entertainment, the game that stands out in your mind as an absolute classic. I'll throw to you, Kieran, what stands out in your mind when you think of England's greatest World Cup match?
Really hoping to have nicked Miguel, so thank you for coming to me first. I'm going to say England-Argentina 2-2, last 16, 98. I was 1 year old, so I wasn't there. I couldn't remember it, but I remember the narrative carrying through to 2002, right, with Beckham sending off and then him scoring a penalty against Argentina in 02. Like the amount of things that happened in that game, like Owen's fantastic goal, Beckham's red card, Argentina's genius goal from a well-worked free kick, and the penalty shootout drama. I think it was that for drama that was top draw.
That was certainly one of my candidates, and it probably, in terms of drama from start to finish, yeah, it probably is. But you've got to mention that the one that has a greater historic resonance is another Argentina game. It's 86. I mean, that is like, in terms of the scale of that and what it meant to football, and even England's late rally on going 2-0 down, getting one back, and like Oliver Kachea heading the ball off the line with the back of his neck. I actually interviewed him about this in 2018. Yeah, you've got to go England, Argentina 86 for everything it meant with Maradona and all that.
Yeah, I mean, we obviously got to mention that, the 66 World Cup final was actually a pretty good match as well. My favourite, I don't know if it counts as the most entertaining, but my favourite was England beating Colombia on penalties. I think there was just a unbelievable tension to that game, and winning a penalty shootout for the first time. I think the first time, that was our first World Cup win, I believe. England's first World Cup win, wasn't it, on penalties? The relief was incredible. I remember hugging my colleague Sam Lovett in a sort of quite passionate embrace. It was just an incredible moment. So yeah, that goes down probably as my favourite World Cup match, despite not being that thrilling, probably the game as a neutral. All right, we'll move on to we're building our World Cup 11. We think we've got just the right amount of weeks left before the World Cup to build an entire team and a manager as well. Our goalkeeper last week, we selected Iker Casillas, and we're now going to pick a right back. I don't think we've actually decided a formation, but we'll come to that when we get to the midfield. A few obvious mentions: Cafu, Carlos Alberto, Kyle Walker might be generous.
You could nearly. I mean, this is actually one of the most stacked positions for probably the most unfashionable position on the pitch, right back. Not in Brazil, because there are a series of them. As you mentioned, Cafu, Carlos Alberto, also Jalma Santos from the 1958 team. And
Zanetti from Argentina.
Yeah, Javier Zanetti. You could go through various Italian sides as well. This is actually a surprisingly strong position.
Any other candidates, Kieran, that we haven't mentioned?
I don't think we mentioned Philip Lahm. Obviously scored a worldie of a first goal of the 2006 World Cup from left back at that point, and he led his country to the World Cup in 2014. So, I think he's another candidate.
Think of the best French right back over the last few
Lilian
years.
Thuram.
I was going to say Lilian Thuram.
Thuram, who of course got two in the semi-final against Croatia as well. Very rare goals for Thuram, but talk about World Cup moments.
I would pitch Carlos Alberto purely because obviously part of probably the greatest ever World Cup team, arguably, and also scored maybe the greatest ever World Cup goal. And I think the World Cup it's about history, it's about moments, and that for me was just such a iconic moment. It summed up everything about that team and obviously the pass from Pele. And without having sat down and watched that entire tournament, I feel compelled to vote for Carlos Alberto, but I'm happy to be overruled.
I wouldn't argue against that, to be fair. I think I'd go more Cafu, right back, who's appeared in 3 consecutive World Cup finals. I get another captain from right back who won the World Cup in 2002. So that would be my other contender. But that Carlos Alberto goal, just like you said, a World Cup moment.
Yeah, no casting vote needed. It's a unanimous. Our first unanimous entry.
Iker Casillas and Carlos Alberto, the basis of a luxury team. That wraps up our pod for today. We will be back next week to discuss the USA and its role as host, all the political intrigue that comes with Donald Trump, Gianni Infantino, and this 2026 tournament, which we are sure is going to be pretty extraordinary. All 3 of us heading out there in a couple of months' time. So we'll be discussing everything that comes with this mad 2026 World Cup. But that's it for today. Thank you, Miguel.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kieran.
Thanks, Lawrence.
And thanks for listening.